what I'd like to do is, talk about Britain's approach to preventing and countering violent extremism, what I think are the trends and the sort of direction of travel for it, what that suggests about PCVE approaches in other countries. And in doing this, I'm aware that Britain was an early adopter in these policies and has so been highly influential. Arguably, it's been too influential. That's certainly a point of view that my fellow sort of British commentator Arun Kundanani has put forward, that Britain has been too influential internationally and has sort of maybe taken PCV approaches in directions that haven't always been helpful. When I was last here in September 2019, I talked about the British Prevent strategy being in review. Until about 3 weeks ago, I thought I'd be arriving 3.5 years later and said, Prevent is still in review. But as of early February, it's not. So as Michele said, the long-awaited review of the Prevent strategy by William Shawcross has been published. And so I'm largely going to focus on that and what I think are the key issues coming out of that. And certainly it's not just about what does that mean for maybe the future of Prevent, but what does it also maybe mean for other countries? And one of the sort of questions that was posed by AVERT colleagues to me in advance of coming to Australia was, well, what does that mean for the relationship, particularly between the Five Eyes countries? Because of all the countries, and I think particularly Australia, there's been significant policy convergence in terms of the components of PCV and some of the approaches. And if Britain really is going in a different direction as a result of this review, what does that mean for that sort of those international policy relationships? So I'm going to talk a little bit about what I think are three key issues coming out of the review and what they suggest about the work, not just in Britain, but internationally. Now then. What I first want to do is give you a bit of context to Britain's strategy. And I'm aware that some of the colleagues in the room and some of the colleagues online will be aware of all this because you study this and write about it. But I know that some colleagues will be less aware. So I wanted to talk about how Prevent has changed. As Michele alluded to, I've been, for my sins, I've been following Prevent's progress right from its origins and have followed it very carefully. And in 2020, I offered a book chapter as part of an edited collection about how the British education system was experiencing the Prevent strategy. And my book chapter was called Always Changing, Always the Same, sort of question mark. And I say this because what Britain's Prevent strategy involves, what it does and what it prioritises, has actually changed very significantly since 2006. But the controversies about Prevent have endured and have been very consistent. So those controversies, or those criticisms, that Prevent is essentially Islamophobic, it's focused on Muslims and stigmatising Muslims, that it securitises society, and particularly civil society, and that it also involves significant surveillance. They have endured and remain very constant despite those very substantial changes to the structure and content of the programme. In my work around how Prevent has developed, I've talked about distinct phases in the strategy. So phase one was overtly only about Muslims. It was explicitly only about British Muslim communities. And you can see clearly there, that's where the perception that Prevent stigmatizes and focuses on Muslims has come from. So that largely involved community-based work with young people. It didn't involve, for instance, formal education at all. So it involved youth workers, community workers, only in areas of significant Muslim population. That stigmatizing focus and quite a strong role for the police drove a lot of those early criticisms. It led to a parliamentary inquiry, which I gave evidence to, but it also led to when the new government, the coalition government, took over in 2010, they reviewed Prevent, and the 2011 Prevent review, and you can see there's a regular review process here, the 2011 review led to what I've called phase two, which is a very significant shift in what Prevent was. So it was expanded to all forms of extremism, not just Al-Qaeda sort of inspired extremism. It led to a significant downplaying in the community programs, in the scale and the budget of them. And it led to the initiation of the channel process, which is really identifying at-risk people and then referring them for individual mentoring or counselling if they were deemed to need that. So it significantly grew that process from earlier pilot work. But we then saw an acceleration of that phase two, which may be phase 2+, as I've termed it, which came in 2015 with the introduction of the mandatory duty for frontline professionals to report. So that duty applies on a very large scale. It applies to everyone who works in education, everyone who works in welfare, everyone who works in the health service. It's involved maybe 1 to 2 million frontline professionals in the UK being trained in PREVENT. And the mandatory duty in itself is pretty, certainly unique internationally around radicalisation. I'm aware that Australia has had a mandatory duty for professionals around reporting sexual abuse. And actually, the UK is now currently looking to introduce a similar mandatory duty about knowledge or suspicion of sexual abuse. And we can talk maybe about why mandatory duties. In 2019, a further PREVENT review was announced. And why was it announced? Because I think this is the process that I'm going on to talk about the findings of is quite important in itself. The criticisms had endured into phase 2. But by 2019, there were 2 interrelated reasons why a further review of PREVENT was announced. One was that referrals on the basis of extreme right-wing sort of concerns had actually reached a similar numerical level to those of AQIS-inspired extremism. So government felt that the claim that this is only about Islamism or about Muslims was no longer true. But also there was parliamentary pressure to have a review, and government wanted to get a counter-extremism bill, a separate piece of parallel legislation enacted. And so agreeing to a review was a price that, ironically, they didn't then succeed in bringing the counter-extremism bill through. That review was taken, as we can see, over 4 years. And it's a very stalled process. The first reviewer was actually the original author of the 2011 PREVENT review and was rightly seen as marking his own homework. That's Lord Carlisle. So he was challenged. But then his replacement was William Shawcross, a hugely controversial figure, particularly because he'd written things about Islam being the biggest threat facing Europe, and also some other sort of positions he'd taken as part of the policy exchange right of centre think tank around the whole area of sort of multiculturalism. He'd also then gone on to be the head of the Charity Commission at a point where the Charity Commission focused explicitly on Muslim background charities and felt that they were fundraising for extremism. So he was seen as having a track record. That led to a significant boycott by civil society groups. Why, in spite of all that, why did it take that long for the review to be published? 2 reasons for that. One is Britain, as you're well aware, has been changing its prime ministers as often as it changes its socks in winter, and it's been each time that's changed, that has delayed a sort of a policy development. But it's also been delayed by the facts I'm going to go on and talk about. That the review spends a lot of its time talking about individuals and individual groups and naming them. And that led to significant sort of legal concerns about whether it was libeling people. But we do now have the report. So before I go on and talk about 3 themes, one thing I neglected to say was I've said on my slide, and where some colleagues can't see, the UK PREVENT strategy. I wanted to sort of clarify that because I'm well aware that in my own writing I talk about the UK and about PREVENT. So let me just clarify this. Now, Britain has its own complications in terms of its structure. It's not federal, as I was just talking to colleagues about, but it is emerging as a federal model. So Prevent is not a UK policy. The UK is Great Britain and Northern Ireland. Prevent has never applied to Northern Ireland. Rightly or wrongly, Northern Ireland terrorism, which has traditionally been Britain's biggest sort of terrorist challenge in the modern era, is not considered part of Prevent. So it's a British policy. But even then, that's complicated because Scottish devolution means that Scotland does not enact the same version of Prevent. They do not have, for instance, the mandatory reporting duty, and they don't, alongside that, do school-based work around fundamental British values, which is seen as a curriculum or pedagogical contribution to preventing extremism. And in fact, earlier this afternoon, I was reviewing a journal submission about the Scottish version of Prevent that I think will be published very soon. I think is quite interesting. So we are essentially talking about an England and Wales policy. So there's three sort of issues that I identify, which I think do have resonance for other countries in terms of how they go about PCVE. And I'd be interested to know from colleagues about what resonance, what connection or dissonance you sort of see. The first one is, what is Prevent focused on? I.e., who and what should PCVE be concerning and prioritising? There's an overt assertion in the Shawcross review that Prevent is not focusing enough on what it calls Islamist extremism. And it overtly says that it is over-prioritising extreme right-wing extremism and under-prioritising Islamist extremism. For instance, the suggestion that Prevent has a double standard when dealing with the extreme right-wing and Islamism. Now, what I should say straight away here is that there has been a long-running culture war, essentially, over what Prevent is focusing on at the moment. So we have somewhere between 6,000 and 7,000 Prevent referrals a year coming through that mandatory duty. For a lot of critics of Prevent, the overrepresentation of, now I say Muslims, but Prevent is the one part of British public policy that we don't do ethnic monitoring. They only monitor by the type of extremism, not by the ethnic or faith background of those referred. It's very interesting. Britain does this across every other aspect of policy. And I should have said, another health warning is, I was one of a small number of academics who met Shawcross individually as part of the review. I met Lord Carlisle previously as well. I was also in some small-scale academic roundtables about it. And it was an issue I raised with Shawcross, and I know other academic colleagues did as well. So when I say Muslims, these are people referred for Islamist extremism. But so the number of Islamist referrals is much higher than the percentage of Muslim background of the overall UK population. So for a lot of critics, that overrepresentation shows it's an Islamophobic policy. For a lot of the right-wing critics, such as the Policy Exchange think tank, they see the opposite. Their position, which is one that the report largely endorses, in fact, it endorses word for word a Policy Exchange report from 18 months ago, which you might see a connection to, is that overwhelmingly the large number of plots and attacks in the UK are from an Islamist background. And at the same time, the referrals to Prevent are actually going down as a proportion for Islamist background. So Policy Exchange argue that Islamism is underrepresented in the referrals. Their argument is, if 80 or 90% of the attacks are from an Islamist background, why aren't 80 or 90% of the referrals from a similar background? And they explicitly suggest that this is because those referring have different standards, are afraid to refer people from a Muslim background. They actually, I'm not sure it uses the phrase political correctness, but that's essentially what they're suggesting. And in fact, the Home Secretary, in a response to the report being published, talked of cultural timidity in the public sector over Muslim populations. So it's alleging that people are afraid of being accused of being racist if they refer Muslims for extremism. Now, that's not our experience. I worked with colleagues, Joel Busher and Tuffield Chowdhury. I know Joel's going to be doing an AVERT seminar soon. We did the first national study on how educational professionals were implementing the mandatory duty. And teachers did share with us, and they've shared with subsequent researchers, in what is overwhelmingly a white, non-Muslim workforce in education, some concern about their ability to identify genuine Islamist extremism, violent extremism tendencies, and to not sort of mistake religiosity and increased religiosity as mistake that as a move towards extremism. And white educational professionals are certainly clear that they feel more confident about identifying genuine extreme right-wing extremism as a distinction from maybe sort of lumpen racist views. And they feel less confident the other way. But that doesn't mean that they're showing any cultural timidity. They just have some awareness about it. So that suggestion that there is an underrepresentation of Islamism is a very sort of significant one. And the suggestion that in the report that the data has been politicized is a pretty damning sort of comment on those involved in making referrals and then dealing with it. And I think there's certainly, the whole tone of the report has very much got a straw man argument here, in that no one seriously suggests that IS-AQ inspired extremism is not the most pressing threat facing Britain and indeed all the other Western countries at the moment. Literally no one suggests that. But it doesn't necessarily follow that there should be the same portion of actual referrals. Now, one argument being made quite strongly is referrals being made now, particularly in the education sector, and maybe are the potential violent extremism of the future. Bearing in mind that we know that the modern wave of AQIS-inspired extreme arguably can be traced right back to the 80s or 90s in terms of countries like Britain, France, etc., in terms of processes that were going on within civil society. So that sort of mismatch is very unclear, and it feels like it's very unhelpful sort of binary. There's a second sort of issue that can be identified there as well, which is the category in prevent referrals that's been growing the fastest is what's until recently been known as mixed and unclear ideologies. And the report is averting, saying that no attacks can be linked to this category, so it suggests that it has no sort of relevance or efficacy whatsoever. Now, actually, that category has already been broken down, and from now we're reporting it into a number of subcategories, which are school massacres, incel, conflicted ideologies, etc. Now, there's a growing sort of body of international literature which identifies exactly this sort of, whether it's conflicted ideologies or what's been known as salad bar extremism, this sort of pick and mix sort of approach to extremism. The most obvious and topical example, I guess, is Andrew Tate, which I don't know whether it's had the same impact in Australia, but every school in Britain is talking about the impact of and the profile of Andrew Tate, particularly amongst young men. I mean, obviously, Tate has an overt position around right-wing extremism and overt connections to anti-Semitic conspiracies, etc. But he's also claims to be a convert to Islam, and he's obviously overtly misogynistic and has a very clear link to the sort of incel sort of perspective. So where does Andrew Tate-inspired extremism fit in with that? Here, the Shawcross review takes an overt position, for instance, that incel is not a terrorist ideology and says it should be regarded as a form of hate crime. And I did ask Lydia earlier, so is it? You know, it's I'm very clear that Canada, for instance, which is experienced at least one, if not more, sort of lethal attacks linked to incel ideology, Canada currently regards it as a terrorist ideology. So that is certainly a very challenging perspective and potentially a new direction. If the whole report has been accepted by government, what that then means, because incel referrals continue to grow. You know, we had a shooting incident 2 years ago. Andrew, I want to say Davison. So I've gone blank on his name now. Yeah, the guy in Plymouth. Now that wasn't classified as a terrorist incident, which is very controversial in itself. But it's clear that incel ideology was a very big part of his motivation, as well as personal family sort of factors. So that counterterrorism police didn't regard it as a terrorist incident, and that has been overtly criticised. Interestingly, it's Jake Davison. He was referred to Prevent and was regarded as not reaching the threshold for adoption as a case and for mentoring. So a third issue within this about the first theme of what should Prevent be addressing is this associated issue of terminology. You've seen that I've used the word Islamism a lot because the report goes out of its way to say that Islamism should be the term used by Prevent and should be foregrounded as the priority. Now, I know that Australia has had its own debates about categories and terminology. Islamism is not a new development in Britain in the sense that the previous iteration of contest, the latest one was 2018. It's currently in review again, the overall British counter-terrorism policy framework. Contest 18 talked about both Islamist-inspired extremism, but also used AQ and IS-inspired. We held both those things. If Islamism is going to be the only term that Prevent can and should use, that will be problematic for at least a couple of reasons. One is it's long been challenged by mainstream Muslim communities, not just the anti-Prevent critics who we know very well do not speak at all for British Muslim communities, and we have a very good evidence base for me to say that. But mainstream Muslim communities greatly challenge the use of Islamic extremism or Islamism as sort of linking the faith itself to extremism. But also, as a political scientist background, Islamism is a much wider ideology. It's an ideology about political approaches to society, and it's an ideology followed by much larger and wider movements and groups, many of whom are overtly against any form of violence in any setting. So it's an inaccurate term to describe the violent jihadi sort of violent extremism that we faced. The last sort of theme I'd identify is ideology. The report focuses very strongly on role of ideology and suggests that Prevent is failing to address ideology and is not prioritizing the role of ideology. And some of this links to what it does prioritize and the language it does use instead, as I'm going on to talk about in a moment. But it suggests that there is a lack of awareness in practitioners about ideology, a lack of skill or ability to engage with ideology, and a lack of a willingness to sort of confront ideology. It also includes phrases like Prevent is not doing enough to counter non-violent Islamist extremism and below the threshold ideological extremism. So firstly, there's the issue there of the role or profile of ideology itself. I mean, terrorism studies sort of scholars would agree that ideology or an ideological motivation attachment is what defines terrorism as opposed to other types of violence. But what is much more disputed is at what point does ideological attachment or justification, where does it come into the process of planning and carrying out terrorist attacks? Arguably, I think we have a lot of evidence that people who get involved in planning and moving towards violent extremism have weak or very non-existent ideological engagement right up to the point where they do something. So foregrounding ideology as the way of identifying those at risk and the way of engaging with those at risk seems controversial, and certainly based on a very limited evidence base. But it's overtly suggesting that there should be much more work about ideology. It's also quite strange because the channel process of referrals, and we can maybe talk in discussion about the limited numbers who actually go forward to the mentoring or counselling in comparison to those referred for consideration. But those who are adopted in the British terminology for that process, what they receive is overtly ideological counselling or mentoring. Overwhelmingly, the individual interventions are about thinking about worldviews and about counter arguments. So the response is already based around ideology, essentially. So it feels like that's not quite on the money in terms of like what Prevent now does. It also seems to suggest, particularly when it's talking about below the threshold, a confusion of what Prevent is actually about, because the report then goes on separately to talk about Prevent working too far upstream, but below the threshold is arguably too far upstream. And it also seems to, in the background, almost be back to conveyor belt theory ideas of like, if they are thinking about this, that means they must be moving towards planning violence based on this thinking. So it's the radicalization conundrum, absolutely writ large. So the second and very much related theme then is about this term and this framing of vulnerability, which the report in many ways juxtaposes with a lack of concern with ideology and too much focus and framing of vulnerability. And it's very overtly critical of how the term and the concept of vulnerability is arguably shaped how practitioners understand those that they're concerned with, and also their motivations. So the report suggests that the term susceptible should be adopted instead. Now, pedants amongst us could maybe say that there isn't actually very much, susceptible maybe is just as problematic, because the real concern for Shawcross with vulnerability is that it's seen as downplaying the agency or responsibility of the individuals involved. He takes it to suggest that people who are being termed vulnerable are out of control, have no control. It's a problem they have, a deficit that they need help with, not something they need to take responsibility for. So, there's obviously something there about the rational actor model of sort of terrorism. And, one of the most sort of striking quotes from the report is that the use of vulnerability bestows a status of victimhood on all who come into contact with Prevent, negating individual risk and agency. And I'll come back in a moment to the use of vulnerability. Here it partly identifies, and I think there is no disagreement with this at all, that Prevent's referral system has been catching a lot of people with mental health or other issues such as autistic spectrum disorder. And a lot of people are being referred who maybe have no link or vulnerability or susceptibility to violent extremism. I think that is partly a function of mandatory reporting and all the training and focus that has gone with it, plus the fact that certainly in Britain over 10 or 15 years, we've seen a lot of public sector cuts. So other types of services are not available. So people, particularly young people with other types of challenges, have been referred. But at the same time, of course, we know from the work of colleagues like Emily Corner that, again, we need to be aware of binaries here, that it's not that individuals can either have a mental health challenge or have a potential vulnerability to violent extremism. They can be both. And indeed, this is yet another of HudCRES's sort of contradictions, is that one of the things the UK police have done is set up a number of regional hubs with mental health practitioners and counter-terrorism practitioners to really look at individual referrals and see what is the appropriate response. And he actually praises that process. So it's not clear, again, why there is such a focus on concern about mental health. There is a suggestion that the framing of safeguarding and use of safeguarding as a frame in relation to vulnerability has heightened this focus on vulnerability. But professionals have been asked to implement PREVENT explicitly through safeguarding. Certainly in education, health and welfare, the mandatory duty, they've been asked to put forward, operationalise the mandatory duty through their existing safeguarding responsibilities. In fact, our own research and others' research has very clearly shown that the large-scale professional acceptance of the mandatory duty is precisely because not just it fits with those safeguarding mechanisms and procedures, but they accept the argument that it is consistent. They see the consistency from their own professional practice and experience. And indeed, mandatory reporting exists in the public sector, but there is a need to get more reports of those at risk from families and communities as well. And obviously, having worked with Professor Michele Grossman and myself on the community reporting thresholds research, which started in Australia and which we then replicated in the UK, and that's directly led to the Act Early campaign led by counter-terrorism police in the UK, which takes a safeguarding approach to families and members of communities, which is actually asking people to safeguard their loved one by raising a concern they have are getting involved in violent extremism. So that safeguarding frame has been overtly used by counter-terrorism police in the UK, the language and the term of safeguarding and vulnerability. And again, HudCRES praises Act Early and says it should be put on an even stronger and better resourced. And so you'll see that there's a theme of a number of contradictions here between things that are said, but then specifics that are praised, which is taking me towards a conclusion in a few moments that I'm not actually sure behind all the heat how many changes, how fundamental a change there is actually going to be to PREVENT. But just to say something briefly then about this sort of, this sort of focus on the criticism of vulnerability. And I don't think the use of the term susceptibility will make any difference to those involved in mandatory reporting. I don't think they will see a great concern with that, apart from the something that I'll point out in a moment. But there is also criticism in HudCRES of presenting PREVENT as a largely safeguarding initiative may cause confusion for practitioners and frontline professionals. Well, we know it doesn't. But the ex-counter-terrorism police lead for the UK, Neil Bassu's response was lots of PREVENT's work is safeguarding, and rightly so. Unless you get in early with an individual and identify and deal with the aggravating factors, making them susceptible to radicalisers, you will not be able to divert them. And indeed, he argues that is what safeguarding does. It protects the public. One thing I'd say is about why does vulnerability actually reduce responsibility and agency? Is that how those involved in the duty see it? And I'd say absolutely not, from the research that we've done around schools, because vulnerability is a sort of modern generic concept within sort of safeguarding internationally. And indeed, it's a term that's used more broadly within crime prevention policies. And I know that Australia's got Kieran Hardy did a very interesting article about, isn't crime prevention a better frame to understand PCVE than sort of, for instance, public health models? And it's a position I'm sort of sympathetic to. And certainly crime prevention policies, and I know this from my own background of being a youth worker in the past, is very much about seeing people who may be vulnerable to getting involved in, for instance, youth gang violence or drug activity, etc. But that doesn't mean that those identifying them or referring them see those people as not having agency or responsibility for their actions or their intentions, often which are quite violent or quite criminal. So vulnerability is almost a term for being at risk of involvement. It doesn't imply a lack of responsibility, but it implies also they need protection. It doesn't mean they need challenging or need an intervention as well. So that's the term vulnerability has a meaning that doesn't imply lack of agency to professionals who work in all sorts of preventative arenas. So those two fundamental and interrelated themes take a lot of the HudCRES report. Alongside that, I think the third sort of issue and final issues I identified are more organisational then, and they're about the scope and reach of PREVENT. PREVENT, as I said, is a national scheme within England and Wales, that version of national, but it's been very asymmetrical in that throughout its history, it's focused on what are known as priority areas. So these priority areas are identified on the basis of intelligence, essentially, what used to be known as heat maps of extremist activity or extremist arrests, convictions, threat pictures in sort of terminology. And those priority areas get much more funding. So they have Home Office funded teams that work exclusively on the PREVENT strategy. Whereas other local authority areas don't have those people. They have the duty, but they don't have any staffing or funding. So it meant, for instance, when the mandatory duty came in, schools and other bodies in those priority areas had trained, experienced professionals who could work with them, guide them, train them, whereas other areas didn't. But the problem with that is that in the area of extreme right wing, 65% of referrals come from non-priority areas. 66% of terrorist offenders from extreme right-wing areas come from non-priority areas, i.e. they don't fit with what's known as the threat picture. And indeed, so PREVENT is moving towards a regional model rather than a priority local government area model to ensure a uniformity, which is a good thing. Although what that does do is then break the link with local politics, local activism, etc. And some of those local government areas have developed things like PREVENT oversight boards, which are not Home Office sanctioned, but are a way of bringing community buy-in, community understanding, and that's likely to be lost. But what it does, it raises a broader issue then of the community-based approach to PCVE, because also there's going to be a further reduction in the funding for, there's only been a much smaller number of priority areas, and there'd be much less funding even compared to now for any community-based projects. But Michele and myself have got a forthcoming book chapter in the Routledge Handbook of Counter-Radicalisation. Is that the title?
Something like that.
Yeah. Which basically questions the future of community-based PCVE. What we essentially argue is that the community-based model or concept has really been about minority communities, about congregated Muslim communities, which is a reality in a lot of Western countries. And if PCVE is about other types of threats, and obviously we've got the issue of like how much activity is online and hence not in specific locales, How much is through other types, such as extreme right wing, incel, etc.? Is there any sense of congregated communities? Then the answer is no. So in what way is community-based work? We've always known that there's the danger of stigmatizing communities by funding and naming particular areas. So I think it does raise that internationally. But the other issue that comes up from the scope and reach is who should be partners for whether it is community-based work or even delivering aspects of work. The other reason that review was delayed for so long was the review spends a lot of time talking about named individuals and named organisations, and essentially saying that Prevent should not have engaged with these people. Some of these people are even intervention providers, i.e. they do individual mentoring and counselling, but the report terms them Islamist and says they should not be engaged with. The report even criticises counter-terrorism police itself for engaging with some of these people. I don't know whether colleagues are aware, but since 2010, British government's had a policy of not engaging with the Muslim Council of Britain, which is the largest and most democratic Muslim representative group. The MCB is actually a federated structure, so individual mosques, communities are members. There's something like 600-700 affiliate members. And the position is anyone who's involved in the MCB should not be engaged with by the government because of positions that office holders have taken about international conflicts. Now, counter-terrorism police have actually developed a national and regional community advisory groups that have all sorts of different types of faith and ethnic communities represented on them. Some of those individuals are also MCB affiliates. And the report is the culmination of policy exchange-led attacks on counter-terrorism police for being willing to engage with these individuals. So what we've got here really is very early on in Prevent, the British academic AVERT talked about values-based and means-based approaches to PCVE. Means-based are working with anyone who actually is committed to non-violence and can identify and divert people away from paths of violence. And the obvious example is the early British police approach, what was known the Muslim Contact Unit, was led by Bob Lambert, that worked with Salafist projects and organisations in London who were against violence and who would work with people of a similar mindset and divert them away from involvements in violence, both in the UK, but also travelling to conflict zones. Whereas values-based are as if you don't overtly sign up to liberal values, then you should not be a partner. And Britain has been on values-based essentially for some time, and this is a further deepening of it, and it makes it harder to do effective PCVE. So, moving swiftly on, where does that leave us then? The whole process of the review, which I outlined earlier, means that it's done nothing to ease the contestation. The author, as well as the manner of the review, means it's not satisfied the critics, and probably nothing short of abolishing Prevent ever would have done that. Despite a lot of the problematic features I've highlighted, there is significant what Clive Walker in a recent article in Studies in Conflict and Terrorism has called the juridification of Prevent, which is more transparency and more legal measures. So, for instance, there were calls to make Prevent compulsory, i.e. that it was compulsory that you should take part in Prevent mentoring, whereas people can choose not to take it up at the moment. The report didn't endorse that. Similarly, there's some helpful introductions about data transparency and how long data is retained within the Prevent process. So actually, there's been some moves forward. It's also in extending the reach of the mandatory duty to include border force staff, immigration staff, and welfare benefit staff, which may be seen as problematic. I'm not, given the contradictions I've identified in the report, things it identifies, but then how it praises specific elements of the report, I'm actually far from convinced that we're going to see any significant changes to prevent as it is, because the referrals being made and the balance of their focus and content represents the reality of what people are seeing. The report is demanding more focus on Islamism, but how do you actually create that? So I may be wrong, but I'm not sure that it's going to lead to so much difference. And at the time, the other final issue I'd identify is that we're highly likely to have a Labour government in the next 12 to 18 months in the UK. Labour has been very quiet on this issue, just as it's been very quiet on related controversies, such as, for instance, returning ISIS personnel such as Shamima Begum back to Britain. You know, Britain is disgracefully out of step, and it's, in my view, disgraceful. It's a reaction to her. Labour's kept very quiet because there is no benefit for them in opposition of saying too much about it. But I think Labour will significantly rethink Prevent again if and when they take power. So I may have to come back and talk about another Prevent review at some point. So anyway, so thank you for listening. And
all right, thank you so much, Paul. Hugely stimulating and informative talk. So we obviously have some time for questions and discussion. And are we able to pick up questions from people who have joined us online? Great. Are there any questions waiting online at the moment? No, that's fine. So we might start. I have 100 questions, but of course I'll defer to people here. Shafra.
Thanks so much, Paul. Do I need to have a mic so the audience hears me? Or I don't need that?
I think you just speak up.
It's okay. I just speak up. Okay. So thanks so much. Great, great overview. Appreciate the reflections on Prevent. So I'm thinking this emphasis on ideology presents a challenge, because if you ask any Muslim, and this is a big generalization, obviously, but if you ask most Muslims what they think of Israel, they will have a negative point of view. What they think of Palestine, it's occupied territory. What they think of the US policy in the Middle East, US is an imperialist going into Iraq and Afghanistan. So the perspective is going to be what would fit an Islamist perspective on world affairs. How does that then fit in with Prevent? Do all Muslims classify as potential terrorists? I mean, that's a perennial question. It's been dogging Prevent from day one. But the re-emphasization of ideology factor, how does that fit in? How are they going to cope with the worldview that most Muslims share?
Yeah, well, and that's the real dilemma about whether we're going to see change. The allegation about Prevent is that, for instance, having Palestine solidarity badges or talking in strong terms about what Israel does, for instance, would lead to a referral. There's maybe been one or two inappropriate referrals like that have been publicised, but Prevent and counter-terrorism police who lead Prevent essentially have been very clear. They're not interested in that. They're interested in people who show an interest or support for violence and a desire to engage with it. If it's about ideology purely, then that might start catching lots of other people. But that would be undoing many years of the Prevent referral system and how it's understood and what its purpose is. So I think there would be a great tension with frontline practitioners who make referrals, as well as then the Prevent personnel who receive them and triage them, because they are very clear it's about, and going back to ideology, it's, the role of ideology. Is it really ideology or behaviour that's actually the trigger for referring a lot of people? For instance, young men that are looking at how to make explosives. Is that really ideology or is that actually behaviour? And it's very much counterterrorism police, as I said, are very clear. It's about behaviours and mindsets of violence, not about political thought.
Just before I come to Lydia, just a quick sort of comment and question to follow this on. So one of the things I first thought when I leafed my way through the HudCRES review was that it's taking prevent and trying to make it a much more antagonistic model than it has. So all the work that we've done over so many years to try to take the heat out of, prevent and similar models through safeguarding approaches. This is full-on antagonism, and it raises the question for me around ideology, which links back to what Shafran was saying. Is it about violence, or is it about values? Which is to say, is it about violent extremism, preventing the violent part of violent extremism, or, as Britain has made clear in other respects, is it just about preventing a kind of extremism that the British system is not interested in supporting? Because it seems to me that this renewed aggressive posture on ideology is actually about the countering of extremism as a value system, as a set of beliefs, not so much about preventing violence. And I'd be interested in your thoughts on that.
So I should have probably said this earlier, but in the 2011 review, it did broaden to cover extremism, not violent extremism. My Huddersfield colleague, Miah, who's been over previously and also talked about prevent, Shamim focused on that heavily in his book on prevent. I've been more cautious about that because in practice, as I said, that there's been a very clear, it's about violence. One interpretation then of this report is it's attempting to take prevent back to that. And there was this attempt also to create a counter-extremism bill that would be dealing with extremism much more generally in society, and that failed because Britain can't agree on a definition of extremism that isn't clearly linked to a pathway to violence and intent of violence, and probably it shouldn't be. It will never get that through the British Parliament because of the civil liberties. But my caution is about how much, for these reasons, it can actually change the operational reality of prevent. But I might be being hopelessly naive about that.
Lydia.
Thanks, Paul. That was such an excellent presentation. So I have a couple of pointed questions, and feel free to take any or all of them. One question I have again is around ideology and emphasis around ideology. Is the emphasis on ideology limited to what they term Islamism, or is it across the board? Do they also emphasize the role of ideology when it comes to other threats like right-wing extremism? In terms of terminology, I'm wondering why another term besides Islamism hasn't been considered, like, say, Salafi jihadism, which is kind of a tad more accepted across, and if there's been a debate around that. And then another one about practicality.
Wait. No, just two.
You can pick which one. Just pick whichever one you want to address. Just around the criticism of the UK police working with groups that are not, aligned in values. Will that practically result in UK police not working with these groups?
Pick two.
No, I'm sure I could do all of them. The UK police their only connection now is with those advisory groups. It's the Home Office itself that funds any of these projects. And in practice, since 2011, there's very few projects that would be seen as controversial in terms of who runs them. So I'm surprised they could even find them. But it puts counterterrorism police to overtly criticise them in the Prevent report for who they engage with is pretty astonishing, given the role that the police play and the challenges they face. In terms of ideology, the report criticises projects that it says are doing generic work around critical thinking skills, even though, as an educationalist, all the international evidence is critical thinking skills, media analyst skills are essential to building resilience against violent ideologies. It's about complexity. But it seems to be suggesting there should be very specific ideological interventions. Now, it doesn't say that should be in Muslim communities, but it follows on directly from paragraphs that talk about confronting Islamism. So it's hard not to draw the conclusion it means there should be much more overt challenge about Islamist ideologies in Muslim communities. But that's not really based on analysis of what's driving actual plots and attacks, but that seems to be what it's suggesting. What was your first question, Sarah?
That's right. I'm going to get in trouble with Michele. So I'll let her know.
We've got some questions online. Thanks, Ben. Okay, so a few questions here. This person says, the report, Shawcross Review, does not focus, actually, no, this names people, and I think we don't want to necessarily go there. So I might come back to that. This question says, thank you for the thought-provoking talk. Given the complexities of so-called salad bar ideologies, what are your thoughts around the issue you raised regarding prevention and incel ideologies? And should those, in fact, go under the umbrella of hate crimes, or should they be considered as part of the terrorism mix?
Well, certainly incel, if not these other types, seem to me. Well, certainly incel is a terrorist ideology for me. It clearly is an ideology linked to violence against women per se. Also, the concern with hate crime is that there is very little hate crime prevention, whereas PCV is about identifying potential future threats. So saying it should be treated as a hate crime, it almost suggests, wait for it to happen and then call it a hate crime. Even though there are clearly ideological spaces and places linked to incel, there is a coherence of thinking, and there is a targeting of people as groups with violence, i.e. women, that goes beyond hate crime.
I might just continue with a couple of the online questions before coming back to Mark. In the context of the Shawcross Review, would a strong Taliban supporter, for example, be now considered to be a relevant referral for prevent? And they ask as an ancillary question, is the Taliban listed in the UK as a violent extremist or terrorist group?
I must admit, I'm not sure whether the Taliban exists in Britain to be listed, to be then prescribed as a group. Probably not in itself. Just simply saying they're being supported. And we've seen with the Manchester Arena inquiry report that came out last week that the attacker and the family community network were overtly linked to overseas jihadi influence groups, and there was very little interest in them, in their network or in their position. So I suspect it would be the same as Taliban supporters.
A couple of other online questions, but I might hold those until we've had Mark's question and yours, and then come back to them.
Thank you very much for your presentation. Just going back to some of the comments you made at the beginning about the influence of the prevent strategy, one area which has been strongly resisted is around mandatory reporting. The suggestion here is that Shawcross Review wanted to extend that to other areas. Yeah. But thinking the other way, what would happen if in Britain you actually got rid of mandatory reporting entirely? Would the whole prevent strategy collapse, or would it continue on as indeed prevent strategies have in other parts of the world?
So there's different perspectives on what mandatory reporting is really about. One perspective is it's just a way of rapidly creating a step change in awareness and practice. And if you now said it's not the law anymore, that step change has already happened in professional consciousness. It was not actually as big a change as it appeared from the outside, because British schools have a very strong inspection framework through a body called Ofsted. They come in regularly, and if you fail an inspection, the management is sacked essentially. And it was already implementing Prevent was already in the Ofsted inspection framework before the mandatory reporting. So in practice, there was already a requirement to do it. The other thing is, has it actually changed behaviour that much? You know, the allegation would be, and I made it myself before it was implemented, that it would lead to over-reporting. There's been a really interesting study by Lasse Lindekilde from Denmark and his colleagues David Parker, where they surveyed British teachers who've got the mandatory duty and Danish teachers who don't. And it found there was actually very little difference in their willingness to report. It found that there was no evidence of over-reporting by British teachers. There was some concern about under-reporting by Danish teachers because of their lack of training and awareness. There's very clear evidence from the different educational sectors in Britain that more training associated with the duty reduces hostility and makes them more confident to report. So it's more of the mandatory nature is maybe overplayed. You know, I mean, there is some professional debate in Britain about, do we need a mandatory duty to report sexual abuse, because anyone who working with people already feels like they have a professional duty to report any types of suspected abuse. Certainly we feel like Prevent has almost disappeared in British education as a named mandatory duty, because it's part of Safeguard. It's become part of established practices and norms. So if they did say it's not the law anymore, it would have that's my long-winded response. It would have very little sort of impact.
So just quickly before we come to the next question, on this issue about referrals, I was really fascinated by the section of your talk where you say quite a high percentage of referrals on extreme right-wing concerns are coming from the non-priority, geographically speaking, the non-priority under-resourced areas. Is that not actually a sign that referrals are working as they are in part intended to, which is as a very early warning indicator of trends that are jumping ahead of where a slow bureaucracy ends up saying, you know, these are the priority areas? Because if the referral system as an early warning or early intervention flagging system is working properly, it should be ahead of where people are currently looking. Is that not right?
Absolutely, and that's my argument about long-term trends. And for instance, Brendan Cox, who's one of our local MPs to Huddersfield, was Joe Cox, who was murdered by right-wing extremism in 2016. I'm working with Joe's sister now on a research project. And her widower, Brendan, said these right-wing extremism referrals are the sign of the future. They are the emerging, just as he named incels, well, these are emerging extremism threats. Whereas now everyone looks back to the 80s and 90s, and certainly, as I said, in Britain and France, we could see this violent Islamist threat growing. We just didn't take it seriously. We were worried about the IRA. And it feels a bit like there's a repeating history danger now.
There's a question up the back. Yep.
I was wondering if you believe that the Prevent strategy is actually securitizing young people, or is it rather victimizing? And how do you see the relationship between these two? Are young people a problem, or are they something to be taken care of, or both?
Yeah, I think there's two related things there. So that sort of at risk or risky sort of binary is, you know, Charlotte Heath Kelly's done loads of work on that. My argument about sort of late modernity and like prevention across, not just in this space but in society generally, is that it holds both those things, and that, you know, that isn't, it's not one or the other, and that's why professionals care about people but also know that they're a potential threat. You know, one of the allegations from social work colleagues who I sort of debate with, is that it sees the young people as the threat, not as someone who's a victim. That's not our evidence from education. That people, including people who taught students who travelled to Syria and died, were like, they feel like they failed to protect that young person, but they're under no illusion about the dreadful things that those people did, which they did. They can believe both things. There's certainly the allegation that it securitizes education, and I guess there's two things about that. One is surveillance. I'm very clear that it has not brought any new surveillance into British spaces. There is a mundanity of surveillance in modern society, and particularly in education. British schools have CCTV, they have electronic logs. If teachers have a concern about a young person, they add it to an electronic log. These are kept on all students all the time. Nothing of these systems is about Prevent. Prevent is using those things. Has it chilled the student voice is the most sort of problematic aspect, most challenging aspect of the surveillance dialogue. And there is some evidence that Muslim students in higher education in Britain feel that they're at risk. But then their students' union body nationally has been telling them Prevent is doing that to them. So it's hard to know whether that's just a feedback loop rather than a reality of experience. Certainly, we've got evidence, say, from further education colleges where students are very supportive of Prevent because they accept that there needs to be safeguarding. So, yeah, we need more on student voice, but the problem is that because Prevent is mainstreamed within education, certainly, they're not actually aware of what Prevent is. So, you've got these bodies like Prevent Watch that say we're dealing with 600 people who've been referred to Prevent. It's bullshit. A lot of these people, not that many people have been referred. So there are some bad actors in the anti-Prevent. There's some liars in the anti-Prevent.
So I might come back to some of the online questions now. So this questioner asks, or says and then asks, the report does not focus on Islamist terrorism, but has its sights on Barelwi and Deobandi representatives. So is the scope of extremism widening?
But it uses Islamism a lot, but the individuals and organisations it names are quite often from those more specific strands. A personal view is that in many ways it's continuing a culture wars about some of those strands of Islamism, and it has very little connection to violent extremism. There's no surprise, for instance, the Cabinet Minister Michael Gove got involved in, even though he has no remit over this area, because he's he wrote a book called was that Celsius 77 in 2006, then, where he basically talked about the threat of British Muslims. And particularly those sort of strands of Islam.
The next question from somebody online says, I note there's been some criticism of Shawcross not doing a particularly thorough job in his review. Do you think this lack of thoroughness that some people have cited will be a factor in UK Labour conducting another review should they win office in the next election?
I don't buy the idea that it wasn't thorough. I talked to him individually. I was part of group discussions. He listened attentively. Shawcross and his team attended a very large numbers of meetings with academics, with practitioners, with critics. The scale of evidence they took in can't be criticised. I suspect that the question might allude to an allegation from one of the anti-Prevent critics that Shawcross only attended a very small number of, say, channel hearings, etc. But I think that's not the same as drawing on a good body of evidence. So the process was thorough enough, arguably. That it's a different matter what you think of the findings and the conclusions being put forward.
So that leads to my own next question. So on the one hand, as you've outlined, I think very clearly, you've got HudCRES review saying we need to prevent, but the definition of what it is that we're preventing seems to be up for grabs. So on the one hand, it's actually about preventing the take-up of extreme ideologies, for which this more antagonistic, aggressive posture is being argued for. On the other hand, you've got the linking of attacks versus referrals, the fact that attacks are a lagging indicator always not being, but that focus on attacks would suggest that the conceptual framework of what it is that we're preventing has actually narrowed away from radicalization and towards over the threshold to violence. But then on the third hand, you've got the criticism of the fact that it's all too upstream, which would seem to go with that, but then the praise for act early, which is nothing if not very upstream. So it seems to me that if you add those three conceptual sort of pinch points together, there is some confusion about prevent's purpose and goal. Where do you see this landing? Once the review has been debated and digested, what is it actually arguing prevent should be prevented?
Well, that's why I'm not convinced that prevent is going to change significantly despite all those things. So, a couple of examples. It says that community projects should be much more focused on ideology rather than the more generic sort of social cohesion or political debating skills, but it's actually reducing the number and funding of projects. We've had, as we've already identified, we've had a number of years of training frontline professionals under the mandatory reporting to really identify interest in violence as being the threshold. So the HudCRES review can say what it wants about ideology, but it will have trouble taking all that backwards. If they put enough political pressure on practitioners, it may lead to lots more inappropriate referrals of people who've just become more attached to Islam, for instance. But I think that ship has sailed. So it's very hard to see how some of the claims or statements can lead to operational change of any real sense. I mean, there are some legitimate things it says, for instance, about what the demarcation is compared to other policies. Is it working too far upstream? Or maybe the projects that are still funded do look more like social cohesion projects or political education projects. So there is a legitimate question about which policy sort of arm that goes under. And I know the minister in Australia has talked about the need for more social cohesion policy and more sort of civics education. And Britain is very weak on that. But there's always a debate about, is that within CVE policy? Is it alongside it? Does it securitize it? Have you been aligned to it, let alone part of that? I mean, as an educationist, I've always been very critical about how little focus there is on ideology and politics in British education. But that's ideology per se, rather than the very specific ideology that I suspect HudCRES wants there to be focused on.
Thanks, Paul. We have time for one or two more questions, if anybody has them. No? Ben, anything else from online? No? Okay. What a wonderfully stimulating and informative, as I said before, talk. I think I have a much better understanding now of what some of the really key issues are and key conundra, that have emerged from this. So thank you so much. And we will wait breathlessly to see what some of the further developments are going to be to prevent. So thanks again, Paul.